The wind carried a biting chill that afternoon as Darius eased his truck off the highway and into the gravel parking lot of Earl's Diner, a roadside spot that looked as though it had been forgotten by time. The kind of place where travelers stopped out of necessity rather than choice, with a neon open sign flickered weakly against a dusty window, barely clinging to life. The only other establishment in sight was a gas station across the lot, its rusted pumps standing like relics of another era. Darius cut the engine, letting the silence settle for a moment before reaching for his wallet and pulling his baseball cap low over his eyes. He had been driving for hours, the long stretch of Route 66 unrolling endlessly beneath his tires. A meal and a quiet moment were all he needed before he continued on. Inside, the diner was exactly as he expected. Checkered floors that had lost their shine, vinyl booths splitting at the seams, and a jukebox in the corner that hadn't played a song in decades. The air smelled of burnt coffee and old grease, the kind of scent that never quite leaves. Behind the counter, a waitress with tired eyes wiped at a surface that was already clean, her motions mechanical, her mind elsewhere. The bell above the door jingled as Darius stepped inside. Heads turned, not just glanced, turned. The conversations at the few occupied tables dwindled into an uneasy hush, the only sounds remaining the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the clatter of a spatula from the kitchen. Eyes lingered on him, measuring, weighing, questioning. No nods of acknowledgement, no polite smiles, just stares. The kind you feel before you even see them. In the far corner, near the window, a group of bikers sat clustered around a table. Their leather vests bore insignias that meant nothing to Darius, but their body language spoke volumes. Dark sunglasses indoors, boots planted wide, laughter that carried a sharp edge like broken glass. The moment he stepped inside, the laughter stopped. A heavy silence settled over their table, like a wave pulling back before the crash. Darius didn't react. He didn't need to. Without hesitation, he chose a booth near the window. Always face the exit, always know your surroundings. Old habits die hard. Sliding into the seat, he adjusted his cap and exhaled, letting the tension in his shoulders fade. He was here for one thing, a meal. Whatever else was stirring in the air wasn't his concern. The waitress approached cautiously, her notepad clutched tightly, her pen tapping lightly against it in a nervous rhythm. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice flat, as if she already knew this was a bad idea. "Cheeseburger and fries," Darius answered, his voice steady, unhurried. "And a coffee." "Black." She nodded quickly, scribbling the order without making eye contact. Then, just for a second, her eyes flickered toward the bikers. Darius noticed. He noticed everything. She turned away, retreating to the kitchen with a pace that suggested she didn't want to linger. Across the room, the bikers were watching him like hawks circling a wounded animal. One of them, a broad man with a thick beard, his knuckles tattooed in black ink, leaned back in his chair, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. Darius ignored them. He wrapped his hands around the warm coffee cup as it arrived, his fingers tracing the rim absent-mindedly. A simple moment of quiet, a break in the long road ahead. But even as he sipped, he could feel the weight of unspoken words pressing in from across the room. The air in the diner grew heavier. The silence stretched too long. And then the first words came. "Well, would you look at that?" the bearded biker said, his voice carrying across the room, loud enough for everyone to hear. Darius didn't look up. The others chuckled, low and guttural. "Seems we got ourselves a tourist," another added, his voice coated in amusement and challenge. Darius took another slow sip of coffee. He had heard them. He simply chose not to respond. And somehow, that silence made them angrier. The air in the diner had shifted. It wasn't just the stares anymore. It was the way conversations had died down to murmurs. The way the waitress hesitated each time she passed by Darius's table. And most of all, the way the group of bikers in the corner had grown increasingly restless. At the center of them sat a man who was larger than the rest, not just in size, but in presence. His thick beard was streaked with gray, his arms covered in tattoos that told a story no one had asked to hear. He leaned back in his chair, balancing it on two legs, exuding the kind of confidence that comes from never being challenged. The first words came like the opening jab of a fight. "Hey, buddy," he called out, voice dripping with condescension. "You deaf? But just rude?" Darius didn't respond. He didn't flinch, didn't turn his head. He simply lifted his coffee cup, took another slow sip, and set it down again with deliberate ease. That was when the snickering started. Low, knowing chuckles from the other bikers. They were enjoying this. The waitress, standing behind the counter, cast a nervous glance toward Darius, her fingers tightening around the edge of her notepad. She had seen this kind of thing before, some unfortunate soul picking the wrong place to stop for a meal, running into the wrong kind of people. It never ended well. Beard Man wasn't done. "I asked you a question." His chair thudded back on all four legs as he leaned forward. His voice had changed. It wasn't a joke anymore. It was a challenge. Still, Darius remained unmoved. That only made them bolder. "Maybe he's just shy," one of the younger bikers snickered, drumming his fingers on the table. "Or maybe he's lost," another added, louder now, testing the weight of his words. "Ain't much for his kind out here." That did it. Laughter rippled through the group. Low, cruel, the kind of laughter that meant this wasn't going to stop. But still, Darius gave them nothing. He reached for a fry, took a bite, and chewed slowly. He wasn't ignoring them, not exactly. He was choosing not to acknowledge them. And somehow that was worse. His silence wasn't submission. It was something else entirely. A stillness that felt wrong. The kind of stillness that preceded something dangerous. Beard Man's patience snapped. The chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood, the sound cutting through the diner like a knife. Boots thudded against the worn tiles as he took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them. The other bikers leaned back, smirking, watching like spectators before a show. The waitress swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter as if she could stop whatever was about to happen. Beard Man, Travis, stopped beside Darius's booth, close enough that the scent of sweat, cigarettes, and beer clung to the air between them. Darius still didn't look up. "Hey," Travis said again, voice lower now, more deliberate. "I'm talking to you, boy." The last word hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. A baited hook. And finally, Darius moved. Not much, just the smallest tilt of his head, just enough to acknowledge that he had heard every word. His fingers set his coffee cup down gently, soundlessly. Then he spoke. "Something I can help you with?" The words weren't sharp. They weren't defensive. They were quiet, even. And that was what stopped Travis for just a moment. He had expected fear, maybe defiance. But not this. Not a man who spoke as if he were commenting on the weather, as if he weren't being loomed over by someone twice his size. Travis narrowed his eyes. "You're sitting where you don't belong," he said. "Don't you know how things work around here?" Behind him, another biker called out, "Show him, Travis. Teach him some manners." Darius exhaled, a breath so quiet it was barely noticeable. "I'm just here for lunch," he said simply. And that calm, that refusal to be rattled, was what finally set Travis off. His hand slammed onto the table, rattling the salt shaker, the plates. "I don't think you heard me, friend," he growled. And for the first time, Darius looked at him. Slowly, his gaze lifted, locking onto Travis's eyes. And everything changed. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was stillness. The kind that doesn't break. The kind that doesn't yield. For just a second, Travis hesitated. And in that second, he knew he had made a mistake. Travis's lip curled, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth, as if he'd already won. His hand, rough and calloused, slapped down onto the table beside Darius's plate, the force rattling the ceramic, sending the silverware jumping. The noise cut through the diner, shattering what little conversation remained. "Boy," he said, the words slow, deliberate, meant to sting. "You're sitting where you don't belong." Darius didn't flinch, didn't even blink. He let the words hang between them, untouched, like smoke dissipating into the air. Then, with the same calm, measured tone he had used before, he spoke. "Something I can help you with." It wasn't a challenge, wasn't an invitation, just a question, simple and direct. But somehow that was worse. Travis's smirk faltered for half a second, just a flicker of uncertainty, before the anger returned, sharper this time, more desperate. His pride was on the line now, and he wasn't about to back down in front of his crew. The smirk twisted into something uglier. "You don't get it, do you?" he snarled, voice rising now, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. "This ain't your spot, ain't your town, and sure as hell ain't your seat." Darius didn't move, didn't shift, didn't shrink. He just sat there, one hand still resting lightly on his coffee cup, fingers barely curling around the rim. Travis expected defiance, expected fear, but this indifference was something he didn't know how to handle. His jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening where they pressed against the table. He had given the man a chance. Now, he was going to make sure he listened. With a growl of frustration, Travis's hand shot forward, fingers reaching for Darius's collar, intent on yanking him up, on forcing a reaction, on proving a point. But he never got that far. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric of Darius's shirt, something shifted. A movement so fast, so precise, that for a second, no one in the diner fully registered what had happened. One moment, Travis was reaching. The next, his wrist was caught, trapped. Darius's hand had moved like lightning, gripping Travis's wrist with an iron-like hold, fingers pressing into the tendons just enough to send a sharp pulse of warning up his arm. The diner fell deathly silent. Travis froze. His breath hitched. He felt it. The strength in that grip, controlled yet unyielding. It was the kind of strength that wasn't about brute force, but something deeper, something trained. Darius's eyes, calm and unreadable, met his. And then he spoke. "Don't." Just one word. Soft, even, but it carried weight. Travis swallowed, a strange, unfamiliar feeling creeping up his spine. Uncertainty. He could hear his crew behind him, waiting for him to act, to regain control of the situation. But in that moment, with Darius holding his wrist in a grip that was neither violent nor kind, he realized something. He had made a mistake, but it was too late to turn back now. His pride wouldn't let him. Travis yanked his arm back with a sharp jerk, stumbling a step away from the booth. His wrist throbbed where Darius had gripped it, a dull ache spreading up his forearm. But the pain wasn't what unsettled him. It was the ease, the way Darius had moved, controlled, unshaken, like he had done this 100 times before. Travis wasn't used to hesitation, not from himself, not from anyone. He bared his teeth in a half-snarl, shaking off the moment of doubt. "You think you're tough, huh?" His voice was louder now, meant for the audience, meant to regain control of the room. Darius said nothing. He didn't need to. That silence only made it worse. Travis turned toward his crew, jaw clenched. "Get up." Chairs scraped against the floor. The rest of the bikers, 5 in total, rose from their seats one by one. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't joking. Whatever this was, it had escalated past words. Darius watched them, his expression unreadable. The waitress, frozen behind the counter, reached for the phone. "Don't," Travis barked, and she flinched, her hand stopping midair. She wasn't sure who she feared more now, the bikers or the quiet man sitting in the booth. Travis rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck. "You got 2 choices, pal," he said. "Walk out that door right now, or we take this outside." Darius exhaled, slow and measured. Then, as if the entire diner wasn't watching, as if the 5 men in front of him weren't ready to tear him apart, he lifted his coffee cup and took one last sip. "I'd rather finish my lunch," he said. That did it. Travis grinned, thinking he had won. "Fine," he said. "We'll do it here." The first one moved fast, too eager. A wiry man with stringy hair lunged forward, fists swinging wild. Darius didn't flinch, didn't step back. He moved through it. A small shift, a pivot, and the biker's punch met nothing but air. Before he could recover, Darius stepped into the open space, drove an elbow into his ribs. The impact was clean, precise, surgical. The biker wheezed, his breath leaving him in a choked gasp as he crumpled forward. One down. Another came from the side. He was bigger, stronger, but slower. His arms went wide, aiming to grab, to overpower. Darius sidestepped him with a dancer's grace, reaching out just enough to redirect his momentum. The biker stumbled, thrown off balance, and in that half-second of vulnerability, Darius struck, a palm against the shoulder, a well-placed shove. The man went tumbling backward, crashing into a booth. 2 down. The largest of them, a brute with arms like tree trunks, thought he had a better strategy. He reached for Darius's shoulder, aiming to pin him to hold him in place. A mistake. Darius turned into the grab, catching the man's arm in a fluid movement, twisting at the perfect angle. A shift in weight, a turn of the hip. Suddenly, the biker wasn't the one in control anymore. With a swift motion, Darius swept his leg, sending the man sprawling onto the floor. Before the biker could react, Darius dropped a knee onto his back, pressing just enough to make his point. "Stay down," he said. 3 down. The fourth man, panicked, reached for a chair. Desperate, sloppy, he swung it overhead, but Darius had already moved before the chair even reached its peak. A sharp step forward, a twist, a control grab. He wrenched the chair free from the man's grip and yanked it down. The biker, off balance, had no chance to recover. Darius closed the space between them, grabbed his jacket, and sent him reeling backward into the counter. For down. The last one hesitated. He looked around at his friends, groaning, dazed, sprawled across the diner. Then, he looked at Darius. Darius, who was still standing, who hadn't even broken a sweat. Darius tilted his head slightly. "A question. Are you done?" The biker swallowed hard. Then he turned on his heel and bolted for the door. The bell above it jingled wildly as he shoved it open and disappeared into the parking lot. 5 down. The diner was silent. Darius exhaled, straightened his jacket. He glanced at the mess. The overturned chairs, the men groaning on the floor. Travis, still slumped over the table, looked up at him, his expression a mixture of pain and disbelief. Darius held his gaze. "I told you to back off." And just like that, it was over. The diner was silent. The only sounds were the shallow groans of the men on the floor and the faint hum of the old neon sign outside. The air was thick with disbelief, heavy with something unspoken. Darius exhaled, slow and steady, as if he had simply stretched his legs after a long drive. No triumph, no smagrin. He wasn't here to prove a point. He was just handling a situation. Without a word, he adjusted his jacket, straightened his cap, and did something no one expected. He sat back down. His plate was still there, his coffee still warm. Calmly, he picked up a fry, took a bite, then reached for his cup, lifting it to his lips as though nothing had happened. The waitress, still standing behind the counter, her fingers frozen around the phone she never got to use, watched in stunned silence. She had seen fights before, seen big men swing fists and break things, seen tempers flare and egos burn. But this was different. Darius didn't gloat, didn't taunt, didn't revel in what he had just done. He was simply a man finishing his lunch. The cook peeked from the kitchen window, spatula hanging uselessly in his hand. A customer in the corner booth, a man with a farmer's tan and weathered hands, shook his head in quiet awe. No one knew what to say. And then Travis moved. His breath was ragged, his pride bruised far worse than his body. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he tried to reclaim some semblance of dignity. His face was red, a mix of anger, humiliation, and something else. Something closer to fear. He looked at Darius, eyes burning with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "What the hell?" His voice was hoarse, uneven. Who are you?" Darius didn't look at him. He took another sip of coffee, unfazed. Just when it seemed he might not answer at all, he set the cup down, glanced at Travis, and spoke, his voice quiet, steady. Just a guy getting lunch. The words were simple, but the weight they carried, crushing. Travis clenched his jaw, but he said nothing. What could he say? The man who had dismantled him and his crew, without breaking a sweat, was now eating a cheeseburger like nothing happened. A nervous shuffle broke the silence. One of the bikers, one who had stayed on the sidelines, avoiding the fight, avoiding Darius, cleared his throat, his voice uncertain. "Why you military or something?" Darius didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge the question. Just a faint, almost imperceptible smile. And somehow, that was more terrifying than anything he could have said, because it left them all wondering, because it let their imaginations fill in the blanks. The silence stretched. The tension lingered. Then Darius stood. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and placed them neatly beneath the edge of his plate. His movements were slow, deliberate, just like everything else about him. As he turned toward the door, the waitress finally found her voice. "Wait," she called after him, her tone softer now, almost hesitant. Darius paused, glancing back at her. She swallowed, then asked the one question that had been hanging in the air since the moment he walked in. "Who are you really?" For a moment, just a moment, he held her gaze. Then, with the faintest hint of smile, he replied, "Just a guy who knows how to finish his lunch." And with that, he stepped outside. The bell above the door jingled softly as it swung shut behind him. Outside, the sky had darkened, the sun dipping low over the endless stretch of road. Gravel crunched beneath his boots as he crossed the lot toward his truck. Near the row of motorcycles, the last remaining biker, the one who had run, stood watching, wide-eyed and silent. When Darius met his gaze, the man stiffened, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. But Darius didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The biker took a step back, then another. Then he looked away. Darius climbed into his truck, started the engine. The low rumble cut through the heavy stillness, breaking whatever spell had been cast over the small, forgotten diner. As he pulled onto the highway, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Inside the diner, people were still standing where he had left them, still watching, still trying to process what they had just seen. The bikers, those who could stand, were slowly pulling themselves together. But they wouldn't forget this. Neither would the waitress. Neither would Travis. Neither would the man who had fled. The lesson would stick. You don't judge a man by how he looks, by how quiet he is, by how little he says, because sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should never test. And for the people in that diner, this wasn't just a story. It was a legend in the making. The highway stretched endlessly before him, the asphalt bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The hum of the engine filled the cabin of the truck, a steady rhythm against the silence. Darius sat behind the wheel, one hand resting lightly at 12 o'clock, the other on the gear shift, his expression as unreadable as ever. The diner was already fading into the past. He didn't dwell on it, didn't replay the fight in his head, didn't savor the looks on their faces when they realized they had made a mistake. That wasn't why he had done it. It was never about proving anything. The road stretched on, as it always did, and he followed it, as he always had. No destination in mind, no place he needed to be, just moving forward. The thought crossed his mind, as it sometimes did, that he could have stayed, could have answered their questions, could have told them who he was, what he had done, the things he had seen. But he didn't, because none of that mattered now. The memories came in flashes, unbidden yet familiar. The missions no one would ever hear about. The people he had saved, the men he had fought beside, the ones who never made it home. Those were the things that stayed with him. Not the bruises he left on arrogant men in a forgotten diner. Not the whispers that would spread long after he was gone. He had spent years in the service of others, fighting battles that would never be written about, protecting people who would never know his name. And now, he walked among them, nameless and unseen. And he preferred it that way. A few miles later, he pulled off at another small roadside stop. This one was different, yet the same. A gas station with flickering lights, a convenience store stocked with stale snacks and overpriced drinks. Inside, a teenage cashier leaned against the counter, earbuds dangling around his neck. He looked up as Darius entered, eyeing him briefly before reaching for the register. "Need anything else?" the kid asked as Darius set a bottle of water down on the counter. Darius shook his head. The kid nodded, then hesitated, curiosity flickering in his gaze. "You military or something?" Darius didn't answer right away. He met the kid's eyes, held them just long enough for the question to settle between them. Then he gave the smallest of smiles. Just a guy passing through. The kid watched him as he took the water, turned, and walked out the door. And just like that, he was gone. The truck rumbled to life once more, rolling back onto the empty stretch of highway. The sun had nearly disappeared now, casting long shadows across the landscape. Darius drove on, the road ahead vast and open. No recognition, no medals, no stories told in his name, just the quiet knowledge of what he had done and what he was still capable of doing. Somewhere behind him, in a small town on Route 66, a legend had been born. But Darius wasn't looking back. He never did. Strength isn't always loud. It doesn't need to be. The strongest people are rarely the ones who raise their voices, who throw their weight around, who make sure the world knows exactly who they are. True strength, the kind that matters, is quiet. It's steady. It's the ability to stay calm when the rest of the world loses control. Darius knew that. He had lived by it. He had seen men who thought strength was about dominating, about intimidation, about being the loudest voice in the room. But when the time came, when things got real, they were the ones who fell apart first. The truth is, the ones who boast the most, who push the hardest, are usually the ones hiding fear beneath their bravado. They mistake volume for power, aggression for control. But real power? It doesn't need to announce itself. That night, in that diner, the bikers thought they had found an easy target. They thought numbers mattered. They thought their laughter, their taunts, their threats would break him down. They were wrong. Because a man like Darius had nothing to prove. They learned that the hard way. But the lesson wasn't in the fight. It wasn't in the way he dismantled them one by one, in the way he walked out of that diner without so much as a scratch. The lesson was in how he carried himself before any of it even started. It was in the way he didn't flinch when they tried to get under his skin. It was in the way he let them dig their own graves with their arrogance, never once giving them the reaction they wanted. And in the end, it was in the way he simply walked away. Because strength isn't about proving a point. It's about knowing you don't have to. Darius didn't care if they told stories about him after he left. He wasn't looking for respect, wasn't looking for recognition, but for the men on that diner floor, for the waitress who had seen it all unfold, for the bystanders who would retell the story in hushed, awed voices. One truth had been made clear. Never judge a man by what you think you see, because sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one you should never test. If this story made you think, don't just scroll away. Take action. Like this video to help spread awareness. Share it with your friends and family, because conversations spark change. Comment below and tell us your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed an abuse of power? Let's talk about it. Follow our channel for more powerful real-life stories. And turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Change starts with awareness. Awareness starts with you. Be part of the movement.